Okay, I think this is going to work. I am going to read an installment from my book I'm working on. Sometimes reading it out loud helps you discover inconsistencies or other issues, so that's one of the reasons I'm doing this. This is a second draft. There might be some revisions, but I don't think much. I'm pretty happy with it, and if it changes substantially, maybe I'll go back and redo some of these videos. But anyway, here we are. I'll be reading off screen, and you don't have much to look at here, but so if you want to turn the screen off and just listen, that also works. The title page is it was 100 Days, a parable regarding the end of the human world and the preconceptions that must be set aside during our journey out of darkness. This story is a work of fiction. All names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Copyright 2025. All rights reserved. So, we start with the foreword. My name is Cougar. As I write this, it was over 2 years ago that the modern human world, as it was known at the time, came to its final crashing and ringing conclusion. We didn't realize at first that modernity was toast, but by 100 days into it, we certainly did. It was mostly a long process of letting go, but by 100 days in, we had collectively begun to look to the future and not the past. The past had died in fire and freeze, in wind and rain. In our dreams, both bright and dark, it died, until finally we had let go of it, as one lets go of a dead thing. In a dismal way, it was liberating, a pure experience of renewed purpose. At around 100 days, we were all in. And so this story, or journalistic account, or whatever it is, the stimulus to create and polish this memoir came to me from a visitor who arrived a few days ago, an elderly woman calling herself Brigid. Something of a traveling bard, I suppose. She arrived bringing news from the wider world, not all of it bad, and in any case more than we might have had otherwise. In exchange for news, she accepted a meal, and then wanted to hear the story of how we had managed to survive and thrive. I hauled out my laptop computer and started summarizing from my rough notes. See, she said she would like a copy sent her way, as she was collecting narrative accounts for some planned greater work. We had restored limited internet access a while back. Email was working most days, so I was only too happy to make the effort. I said it might take a few days. Brigid said she would wait. She is, even now, sitting and drinking lemonade in a bent wood rocker out front, no doubt making sure I stick to it. That's fine. Working under a deadline is often a good thing. We've had a lot of deadlines already, as well as too many dead. I'm thinking about both of these as I try to work out what I should say about how we experienced the end of the world. It's been hard, as history can be when you are fighting for a place in it. On the worst days, I found myself reminded of the saying you hear about war, about how it's the dead who are the lucky ones. Anytime I let my mind drift that direction, I remind myself it's not true. For anyone reading these words, the fight has been years, probably long decades, unfolding. Heck, it might even be 100 years, and from that far away, you likely think this story is all curious, antiquarian drivel. Yet in 100 of our days, 100 things that seemed impossible had already grown and bloomed. And since you are reading this, wherever and whenever you are, you already know that, somehow, it all worked out. On the other paw, if nobody reads this, then I guess it means we were too stupid to live, or that Brigid failed in her mission. But no, I want this account of events to reflect survival, even if we didn't, and resilience, even if we weren't. I believe we will somehow endure, and so far, we have. To give the most concise account, I've decided to review and clean up my journal notes before handing them over. There are calendar gaps in my narration, days when, for various reasons that will make sense in context, I could set down little or nothing. After some consideration, I have left these gaps and the other half-formed thoughts as they happened at the time. These are the darker places in the journey, dominated by shadows full of emptiness and hesitation. They are presented in the pages that follow, mostly as these were written down. The empty spaces in the story are also the places where people died and left the story for others to finish. That anyone survived to continue the account, that it did not end, that is what they call a contingent fact of history. I have an ask. Where there are gaps, be still for a moment. If you are very still and listen, you might hear the voices of the lost. They, too, have something to say, and in their way, the dead are always with us. Some of the dead were what civilized people would have labeled as evil. I thought that way at the time, but I have since forgiven all. They were just people, afraid and confused and lost, who fairly frequently had lost their minds just before they lost their lives. If abandoning all hope at the approach of death is abandoning all hope at the approach of death an unforgivable sin? If I can now spare a comforting thought for the wicked, then so can you, dear reader. When it comes right down to it, we were all of us wicked in the beginning of the end of the world. Day 0, a fairy tale. Where to start? Once upon a time, we were greedy and envious, and our attention was consumed by distractions. In our fascination with ourselves, we did not see what was visibly in front of us, though we saw clearly enough once reality had decided to destroy us. We still sometimes argue about what constitutes reality. There is legitimate disagreement over when day 1 of the collapse actually arrived. In this chapter, which I am calling Day 0, I'll be using my personal yardstick to decide when the bridge linking us all to the past fell into the chasm, taking nearly everything we once knew with it. There were countless loose ends that needed to come apart on the way down, and plenty of other things that needed to break for the collapse to gain momentum. That it did collapse is beyond doubt. To recognize the complex nature of global collapse, I'm here going to add a Day 0 chapter as a placeholder for everything that leads to the end of the modern world. It's odd to say it now, but looking back, I realize that nearly nobody was watching when the human world finally ran out of runway. There were people writing on the internet who said things were about to blow up. I listened, and their warnings helped myself and others to make sense of things and to prepare. Those voices are gone now, of course. I hope it worked out for them. I hope they took their own advice and survived. Even allowing for the clarity of hindsight, we still can't entirely agree on when Day 1 of global collapse, of the big slide, as some are calling it, really kicked off. It was less a single day of seismic changes and more a month, or maybe a year previous, or several. Who can say? But on Day 1, it hit like a meteor. August began under a lot of uncertainty. To an unbiased observer, global civilization was clearly tearing itself apart. To start with, the weather in the northern hemisphere had been terrible. It would be difficult to even call it weather, as the Earth system was definitely derailing. I knew what that meant because I had understood for a long time the role global heating would play in breaking the old and established expectations. Nobody seems to have noticed at the time it was happening, but the onrushing collapse of the Earth's climatic system was gathering steam. It was not supposed to happen like that, certainly not so soon, nor so violently. But planetary physics never cared what we wanted. Denial took us nowhere. When the excess energy was too much to contain, the container blew itself into spinning, lacerating shrapnel, taking the built human world, the only world any of us knew, with it. At the same time, and I will always maintain, as a direct result, of all this unwinding calamity hit us, there was scattered armed conflicts brewing across the continents. The Koreans were at it again. The North had sent 30,000 artillery shells into the South, and Seoul had answered in kind to much rattling of nuclear sabers. There was talk at the time of an impending invasion from the North, and the South was threatening to use their large cache of nuclear weapons to deal with it. How that turned out, we'll never know. The Chi-Coms had landed on Kinmen Island a year before, and then instigated a blockade of Taiwan. A month after that, the Russians had driven tanks and troops a short distance into both Finland and Estonia, and were making a grab for the Suwalki Gap from the direction of Belarus. A large explosion near the frontier town of Tartu in Estonia was rumored to have been a tactical nuke, but nobody could prove it because the Russians declared Estonia a no-fly zone. This was causing a predictable, if cautious, ruckus within NATO. It was all very disturbing, and I began considering what might be the implications of global war. It did not take long to find out. The first verified nuclear exchange was between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This was in late August. The two nations had been exchanging threats and naval ambushes for months, so we knew there were problems coming. Then a critical Saudi oil terminal in the Gulf was suddenly and mysteriously vaporized. After some confusion and unhelpful reassurances, the U.S. government revealed that a primitive nuclear device had been used against the Saudis, probably delivered by a cargo ship via Indonesia. 2 days later, there was a retaliatory strike against the primary Iranian oil terminal on Karg Island. Nobody knows if that attack was nuclear or conventional, or who was responsible, nor will we ever know, as that's when the news embargo started. Of course, Russia had something to say about all this, China as well. The usual finger-pointing about Western provocations, more big words about bigger conspiracies, and inevitable consequences, multipolar threats. And then nothing. No news reports of anything. Here's hoping they all had fun. Nobody around here cares. Not since day one. What can be said of these guns of August? World War III both began and ended in less than a week. We think it ended. It's hard to say. It seems like the nuclear players did their atomic boogie for a week. Here in our little village, a tiny portion of what was once an important city, we have no clear idea what the actual damage was. It couldn't have been too bad because we're still here. My mail order Geiger tube dosimeter hasn't made a peep the entire time, so that's encouraging. Or maybe it's just cheap junk. Anyway, radiation toxicity has yet to be a problem here, so we'll take that as a relative win. Crude oil movement entered critical decline sometime during the blockades and nuclear exchanges, from what little the news said about it. Looking back, it's almost as if they didn't want us to think clearly about that part. Harder to hide, though, was when service stations started to shutter themselves in the few weeks leading up to day one. No gas, no diesel, no propane. One day they were there, the next day they were intermittent, and the next time you looked, they were shut. Concurrently with all that, it took about 2 weeks for the crude oil economy to collapse. What a shock. It was about the same time when the crazies started to lose their minds. In retrospect, I should have seen that coming. Oil was the sticky, toxic glue that held our rotting world together. Until the last hours of day zero, everything that anyone wanted or needed at any time, from any direction, was satisfied courtesy of fossil fuels. Turns out, crude oil was also the thread that kept some people's minds from unraveling. When the gasoline supply became intermittent, the most vulnerable among us, and the least resilient, came apart at the seams, as did everything else in short order, so it's difficult to blame them for having a weakness of the mind. All of us were blindsided. Nobody knew what to do. The mainstream media was a lot more interested in the resulting collapse of the oil economy than they were about any nuclear exchanges between nations that most Americans couldn't find on a map. It's interesting now to reflect how the most feared event anyone could ever imagine, a global nuclear exchange, barely made the news. But we'll never forget the day when the gas stations closed. Never. Unless you're among those being vaporized, World War III turned out to be the least of our challenges. And honestly, was nuclear war ever a challenge to anyone? Once you vaporize, your personal problems are over. In the run-up to day one, it was nothing but problems, and none of them with obvious solutions. The scramble was on for secure food, fuel, clothing, and weapons, ahead of an expected collapse in supply chains caused by lack of fuel resources. That lesson about supply chains we learned in a kind of preview of coming attractions during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. News outlets and social media took perverse delight in showing us how poorly people were coping during day zero. Looting, shootings, arson. The most disturbing to me were the cult-like mass suicides and ritualized murder being reported in gruesome, gleeful detail on social networks. As I mentioned before, when the fuel supply collapsed, the least stable and most conspiratorial parts of the country let themselves go over to the dark side. The cult of oil worship was always a death cult. Like all such cults, the worship of oil ended when it murdered its adherents. These days, I don't like to think about that chapter. For my part, I did not witness very much of it. For me and my neighbors, the rise of rampant cruelty and abject insanity was mostly an unverified rumor, reinforced by events that came to us by night, or later when finding loose heaps of rodent-chewed bones dressed in rags. It felt like a wave of shadows spread across the land, like ring wraiths out of some Tolkien-esque fantasy, hunting elves and men. My neighbors and I had our walls built early, and we stayed behind them, thus avoiding most of the madness. Most, but not all. Okay, enough of memory lane. It was bad, it was scary, and at times it felt demonic. Some people lost their minds, but not everyone. And that was just the opening act. Nobody expected day one to happen the way it did. And there's a footnote. Note to Brigid. Since we recently restored limited internet access, I uncovered some data and discussion concerning the cost and availability of crude oil during the collapse. I found it interesting and thought you might as well. And it is relevant to some of this narrative. I'll be including oil price and fuel availability information where it makes sense. On day one, the price of oil had hit $103 per barrel. That was up from an average of about $85 per barrel in the months leading up to the global collapse. Okay, back to the journalism. Day one. Surprises. With all the geopolitical monkey business afoot, I decided to stock up on some essentials. I knew global supply chains might be tanked for a while, as seems to happen. That's some of what we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. I had planned to gas up the old Dodge on the way to Home Depot when I discovered the local service station was packed with others having the same idea, with vehicles in a line out to the street. I slow drove past this, taking a close look, and it looked crazy. People were filling up their vehicles and gas cans, even 1-gallon milk jugs. Some were arguing about their order in line, others were fighting over access to the gas nozzles. Lots of tension and red faces. It reminded me of the opening minutes of a Hollywood zombie movie. With all that going on, and I was still thinking of zombies, I decided to try another service station I knew was further up the road, near the airport, but still on my way to the hardware store. That worked out better. While I was there, I asked a guy filling up his truck and a portable generator what he thought was up with everyone lining up for fuel. He told me that an internet rumor was going around about how, due to the wars in the oil patch, the government was preparing to ration gas. It might be time to take this seriously, I recall thinking. The lines at Home Depot were deep on day one, with shopping carts full to the brim. I saw people were buying a lot of bleach and plastic sheeting and tape. There were plenty of loads of plywood and lumber, too. This didn't make much sense to me at the time. It's not like we were expecting a hurricane or flood. Even so, I bought a little more stuff than I had planned, including a few rolls of duct tape and some bleach. The smartest thing I did that day was buy a haul of heirloom seeds from a kiosk near the garden department. I figured if there were to be a serious global shootout, the first thing to break down would be food supply chains. Got home without any issues. The traffic was bonkers on day one. Funny, it's years later, and traffic like that would now be a welcome sign of normalcy. Footnote: Brigid, the price of oil ended the day at $120 a barrel. Day 2. Dawning awareness. The next day I worked on projects around the house, with an eye toward tightening things up, fixing anything broken, and such like. I kept an eye on the news feeds rolling in on my phone every few minutes, and eventually turned my shop radio to a local station. The national news was bad and getting worse by the hour. There was a major war taking place on the Korean peninsula, and troops from either Russia or China had landed on some Japanese islands. The Saudi royal family had gone into hiding. China was sinking ships around Taiwan. In the afternoon, my wife and I sat down, had a sit-down discussion concerning events in the world and where we stood. I decided to hit the bank for $500 cash and to do that daily for a few days, or until they ran out of money. I try to keep a few thousand cash in the house at all times anyway, but if things were set to derail, then more cash on hand seemed like a smart bet. The wife planned to go shopping and stock up on some canned foods and supplies. Afterward, I got on the internet, hit a familiar food distributor in Orange County, and ordered some things in bulk I knew the stores wouldn't have for long. We bulk order about twice a year. Rice, beans in several varieties, nuts that store well, dried fruits, wheat berries for flour, field corn for cornmeal, rolled oats, and other such staples we've become accustomed to. It's partly about disaster planning in earthquake-prone California, but mostly because we like the convenience of having raw materials for food in the basement. The bulk order would take a week to arrive by freight. I figured that would be plenty of time. It did not yet occur to me that trucking would already be a problem. Footnote: Note to Brigid, the price of oil ended the day at $126 per barrel. Day 3. On the run. On the morning of day 3, my daily news feed had some items about riots, mostly in Europe and Asia. Likely the rest of the world was in the same fix, but didn't merit coverage. From the reporting, it sounded like people were wanting mostly for food and fuel supplies. Large numbers of others were trying to go places, were being turned back, and were none too happy. As such, there were angry crowds reported near rail access, airline access, ship and ferry access. Anything that moved had considerable crowds trying to get away. People were on the run. The ferries were packed enough that 2 had tipped over, both of these in India, with significant loss of life. The Paris suburbs were lit up with street fighting and clashes with police. No idea what that was about. It seems to happen a lot there. It was just another data point suggesting that people were starting to panic. My wife had a conversation with our Costa Rican neighbors named Mora. I was in the basement at the time, laying up water storage in some food-grade barrels we have for collecting rainwater. I heard about the neighbors later. The young woman next door, living with her working-class parents, was missing her husband, who worked in construction. I had met him a few times before. I didn't know very much about him. He seemed like a good guy. A month before, he had taken a job in another city, a few hours' drive away, and was staying there in some temporary housing until he got paid a few times. He wouldn't get back for another several weeks. His wife had their new baby with her, and was fretting because he hadn't called in days. and they were running short of money and food. They were 2 weeks behind on the rent and were afraid of eviction. My wife told her how, if their family needed anything, just come to the house. To the young woman's credit, she said she would. They are nice people, and I hate to see young couples with children struggling too much. And the elders have always been friendly and hardworking. This reminded me of the food order I had placed. I was having an odd feeling it might not be coming together. I promised myself I would check on it the next day. Day 4. The wheels come off. 4 days into the big slide, we had the first signs of that things were going sideways, and in a big way. There were columns of smoke in the city to the south. Plenty of people lived down that way, sprawling suburbs, most of them well off. You wouldn't expect many problems. From the sound of sirens coming from that direction, lasting for 2 hours, it was likely all hands on deck down there. The local fire stations emptied. We could hear the sirens, and for an hour after that, there was a constant stream of sirens headed south. I never heard what that was about, but I could guess as well as anyone else. It made me think about the long lines at the service station and the shouted arguments about privilege. I went inside later and I did an internet search for a good police band radio scanner. Toward nightfall, I learned from a passing neighbor that there were no longer any operating service stations in the area, and that earlier in the day he had driven almost 30 miles to fill up his car. On day 4, the wheels were coming off. Day 5, exploring options. Having no errands to run, I stayed home and monitored the news reports. While working out in front of the house, I had a conversation with a guy passing by, walking his dog. He asked if I knew anywhere he could buy gasoline. I said I did not. Then he asked me if I had any I could sell. I said I did not, and good luck. I shouldn't have been bothered by it, but what with everything else going on, it made me nervous. It told me that people were beginning to explore their options, so to speak. The wife and I discussed the situation still evolving next door. She had gone to their house to see if anything had changed and discovered that they were being evicted the next day due to non-payment of the rent. After some thought, I felt like we should make preparations to feed a crowd. I mentioned the food order I had placed earlier, and she agreed that had been a good call. Afterward, she went to the thrift store to see if they had mattresses in good repair and baby clothes, just because. I spent the middle part of the day clearing some space on the back patio and bringing in a few pieces of lawn chair. If need be, the neighbors could stay there until something else could be sorted out. I called the food distributor in Orange County to politely inquire about my shipment. My hunch was right. They were having trouble finding a hauler. I asked if a bit more money would solve the problem, and he said that wasn't how they did business. My bad. I clarified that I would pay whatever additional fee the shipper needed to prioritize an order, and he said he appreciated the sentiment. He guessed at a figure. I authorized 50% above that, and said he could keep any remainder for his trouble. Finally, I thanked him for the many years of friendly and helpful service, with the hope we would be doing more business in the future. After I hung up, I had a premonition that I'd never hear from him again. Events in Southern California were likely to get real hot very fast. The story of Southern California. I'm going to interrupt the flow of things right here for some specific comment on the situation in Southern California. I'm writing this 2 years after the events, so some of what I can share here is based on later experiences rather than on some kind of predictive power. I've never lived there, nor do I know anyone who has, but it is easy to understand the situation there. More to the point, in all the time we have endured the big slide, I never met anyone who successfully escaped the Southern California megalopolis. My guess is none did. This needs an explanation. Humanity in modern times, meaning the times that are forever behind us, lived in what we call now a built environment. It was not a natural environment, but one that was completely artificial. The built environment was composed of thousands, if not millions, of moving parts that had to keep moving day and night without interruption to support human life. The artificial habitat needed constant inputs from outside itself, inputs of electricity, food, water, fuel supply, medicines, and a million other things large and small. Virtually nothing could be entirely created inside the built environment. For example, while you could bake fresh bread, you could not grow wheat for flour. While you could sell fruits and vegetables at a market, those items were delivered into the built environment from hundreds or thousands of miles away. Electricity and water supplies, same thing. And while California had its own oil and gas industries, most of the actual fuels from crude oil made available in large urban areas were refined and shipped in from all over the world. The natural gas supply in California was delivered via extensive pipelines and processing facilities, the parts for which came from all over the world. Embedded in all this were the people necessary to make it work. People with special skills and experiences, using specialized equipment, who kept the entire cathedral of technology open for business, all day, every day, without pause. These people drove on the freeways every day, stopped in the markets, had homes and families in the suburbs. When the cracks began to form, they stayed home, like everyone else did. At which point, the cracks dominated until the entire built environment fell to ruin. I was not there, but I did not need to be there. That is how modernity blew itself to pieces throughout the human world. The larger the built environment, the more completely it imploded. Of course, most of the people in Southern California had no idea that any of this was going on. In fact, the great virtue of the constant effort to maintain modernity was that it was almost, if not completely, invisible to the vast majority of end users. People didn't know, except in a vague way, where their food and water came from, nor did they give this any focused consideration. Same with electricity. People had no visibility into the built environment. They lived inside it, but except when it broke in spectacular fashion, they had no idea it was there. This was nowhere more true than in Southern California. The dark side of all this was that the built environment there was all along a death trap. A death trap is a kind of trap that, once you fall into it, you can neither get out of nor survive. Southern California had been a death trap for probably 100 years. Generations of people have been born into the trap, lived their entire lives there without ever understanding that if things broke down, they would likely die there, and quickly. Sometime during the early days of the Big Slide, during the opening days of the collapse of the built environment in Southern California, people must have suddenly understood that they were trapped. It didn't matter that they understood, or when they understood this. For most of them, it was already too late, and had been too late for a generation or more. There had been a few early warnings about this, but I was acutely aware, many years before, that nobody had learned from these examples. The decade of intense SoCal fires, the landslides, the heat waves, and concurrent energy supply interruptions. Entire communities had been destroyed by the fires, giving people a small taste of how well their world held up to massive dislocations. What they mostly learned was that it didn't hold up at all. If you had a lot of money, you could save yourself. If you didn't, then you were blown away. The first indication of a systemic problem was the abrupt exit of nearly the entire insurance industry serving California. Insurance companies were always in the business of understanding and distributing risk, and made no allowances for ideology or political niceties when setting rates. When things began to blow apart in SoCal, the insurance industry operations for the entire state folded up. They folded up when mountain communities, often prime real estate, began to burn regularly. The Camp Fire, the Palisades and Eaton fires, the many fires and mudslides in Malibu. These and many more nearly wiped out the insurers in California. People approached all this as if it were primarily an economic problem, a matter of money. What almost nobody understood that it was a huge problem with the built environment. People could not get out. During the many fires, people waited too long to evacuate and then found the roads unpassable due to flames, smoke, and abandoned vehicles. In the Palisades fire, first responders had to use bulldozers to clear the roads of all the abandoned cars from people trying to outrun the flames and failing in the effort. In the Camp Fire, the few roads out of the City of Paradise were immediately blocked in the same way, and nearly 100 people died in their cars stuck on the road, still trying to get out. 100 dead is itself nothing much, but it was a signal that something was horribly wrong, that these were bad places to live. The lesson, for those who understood, was that these places were death traps. This contingent fact of history would become a big part of why modernity collapsed. People couldn't get out to save themselves, and if they did get out, then the people who were needed to maintain the entire inertial mass of modern life would not be there when things started to break. The actual collapse itself happened over a span of a week, during which 300 years of global industrialized civilization unwound itself into utter ruin. Day 6. Too close to home. There was some violence of a kind a few blocks away. I heard about it while I was taking a walk around the block. I came across some neighbors huddled as a group in the middle of the street, heads down and having a discussion. The story was the local service station had run out of gasoline a few days before, and someone desperate for fuel had lost their composure and shot the attendant. Nobody died, but everyone was rattled by it. Not that it mattered, but the station was closed due to a police investigation. They were also talking about the events of a few days back, south of downtown. I hadn't been paying much attention, so this was the first I had heard. Apparently, another service station had been looted and then set on fire. There were a series of home invasion robberies and some other random fires that had been set in the area. I hypothesized that the fires were intended to divert the police away from the robberies. That made everyone stop and think. Criminality, it seemed, was getting itself organized. While everyone else was left chewing on that news, I mentioned we should create a mutual aid group. Things like establishing a phone tree, designating some homes as safe houses for anyone who has to run from danger. This was broadly agreed, and one of the older couples offered to get started pulling that together. We all shared our phone numbers and street addresses. I told those in attendance the digital entry code to the side gate of my property, with instructions to let themselves in and bang on any door they could find. And just like that, the ball was rolling. Not a day too soon, as it turned out. Footnote to Brigid. Crude oil had shot up to $180 on the day with heavy volatility. The U.S. Congress passed a bill to halt domestic crude oil exports. The state of California launched an investigation into reports of hoarding of gasoline and diesel supplies. I don't know how you feel about it, but the very idea of an investigation sounds funny as hell to me. Day 7. Hardening and listening. In the morning, I woke up to a text message that my food shipment was on the way. I can't tell you how much of a relief that was. It cost me a small fortune, but I had not a single complaint. For the record, that food supply lasted more than a month, and looking back, may have saved all our lives. The rest of the day was more digging in, having already been warned that people were probing for resources. Around here, we call that situational awareness. I strengthened the front fence and covered the back of it in some concertina wire I had bought a few years ago, just in case. Yeah, that's how I operate. From the front, you couldn't see the razor wire, but anyone trying to climb the fence would have to deal with it on the way down. Either way, it works for me. The police scanner I ordered showed up in the afternoon, and in the evening I set it up. I listened to it for a while subsequently, and what I heard going on was sobering to say the least. Home invasions, arson, retail break-ins didn't seem normal to me, but I hadn't been paying much attention up to then. I would be paying a lot more attention going forward. At bedtime, I could smell smoke. When outside, it was from somewhere close. Smelled like burning wood, but also some plastic or rubber, and that meant a structure fire. I didn't hear any sirens. Given what I had been hearing on the police scanner, I figured they would let it burn. There was already nothing left to save, as we learned over the next week or two. By day 7, the collapse of global industrialized civilization was in full swing. I knew it. The neighbors knew it. Nobody was talking about it, but we knew. There was smoke in the air without fire engines rolling. Violence without the police showing up. Shots were being fired. Cars were careening down the streets. On my scanner, there were so many 911 dispatches coming in that most would have gone without a response. The wheels were coming off in a big way, and nearly everyone knew it. Those who saw this as an opportunity for personal enrichment were already hard at work. The story of public safety. I've already said something about the built environment and how long it lasted without the wrapper of modernity. A key part of the infrastructure story was always public safety. Where I lived, that was police, fire, ambulances, highway patrol, county sheriffs, and the state National Guard. As with everything else, it could only last as long as the professional class felt comfortable dedicating their time and attention to the mission. From my personal experience of it, police and fire protection lasted a bit over a week after the modern world failed us. Not because they didn't have the fuel or equipment to roll. A week is not a long time where those are concerned. Rather, the men and women who were sworn to protect the public found themselves with competing problems at home, where their families were having to deal with the emerging catastrophe in food and fuel. I don't blame the police and firefighters for giving up. It was the correct call. Whatever the reason, they stopped coming to work and instead focused on getting their own families to safety. I don't know when the hospitals failed, but it must have been early on. After the first few days of the collapse, I did not see nor hear ambulances on response calls. I heard from news reports that hospitals were being overrun, and one of our regional medical centers had been ransacked and set on fire. The most elderly and chronically ill members of society would be the first to fall to all this disorder. Some people need access to medications just to survive every day, as well as treatments like kidney dialysis. Without refrigeration, insulin supplies have a short shelf life, as do many antibiotics. Supply chains for medical supplies would have collapsed along with everything else. Even before the crisis, most Americans lived in underserved communities lacking clinics or proper walk-in care. These people would rely on hospital emergency rooms for routine support. All of this went underwater during the early days of the onset of chaos. Shortly after, most hospital emergency wards would have ceased operations and their staff have stayed home. What happens when someone dies? In the past, you would call 911 and wait for someone to show up. So what happens when nobody shows up? You have a body on your hands, probably someone you cared about. Now you are stuck. At what point do you stop calling 911? When they stop answering the phone? At what point do you have to dispose of the body yourself? And how do you do that? Do you have a shovel? Can you dig a grave? Would you even bother? Under these circumstances, most bodies would go uncollected, unburied, and left to rot. The living might be forced out of their own homes because they wouldn't know what to do with a dead body, while in other cases, bodies would start to accumulate in the streets and in backyards. The smell of death is a potent motivator. Humans seem about as sensitive to rotting flesh as are animals we think of as scavengers. It is broadly accepted that early humans used to raid the kills of more powerful predators, driving off killers like lions and hyenas to steal their meals. This is also why humans have such acidic stomachs, so we can consume carrion without being poisoned by bacteria. As such, our capacity to sense death at a distance and to react strongly to this means that having numerous dead bodies around us is a big deal. We are aware, and we react. Modern civilization had, for centuries, created a situation where nearly nobody had to experience this. Soldiers on battlefields had a different situation, but soldiers also had their lives forever changed by war, meaning by death. The quaint notion of personal property was an early casualty of the big slide. They tell us that laws are for honest people. That might be true while laws have any bearing, meaning when the chance of getting caught breaking the law remains high, when chaos and disorder take over, when civility is set aside. Any prior agreements on what constitutes civil behavior evaporate. This transition can happen almost instantly, certainly in just a few days. At their core, everyone has an unexplored capacity for criminality. Some people, maybe most people, adopt any collapse of the rule of law with extravagant enthusiasm. They'll go on to create as much additional chaos as they can take advantage of. Chaos and disorder are self-reinforcing, and as such, are the context of civilizational collapse. The tragic irony here is that everyone, including the criminal class, relies on civil behavior to survive and will be allowed to retain their gains after the fact, possession being 9/10 of the law and all that. The criminal class was always the most optimistic about the sanctity of civil order, if only because they relied the most on it. Not in the practice of order, of course, but in the expectation that order will protect everyone, including the criminal class. I can say now, from the vantage point of this post-collapse world, that the criminal class, or if you'd rather, the criminal impulse, were completely betrayed by the persistence of widespread incivility. Criminality ground itself to a halt. It wasn't the dedication of the police, nor the fearlessness of the fire brigades that brought criminality to an end. It was simply that the civil order they needed for survival never returned. Without order, even the criminal class floundered. Stated more bluntly, the criminal class in particular was betrayed by rampant chaos. These were the people with the least resources, the least preparedness, and the least room to maneuver. Their chronic desperation lent them the narrowest focus, being on rampant and uncontrolled consumerism, even as the scaffolding of the consumerist dream fell down around their heads. In the opening days of the big slide, people were breaking into homes, stealing appliances, furniture, clothing, and jewelry at the very moment when they should have been securing land and seed for their future food supply, without which provisions they slowly and inevitably perished, their ill-gotten goods unable to feed them. Whose fault is that? Eventually, most humanity would die regardless, whether they embraced chaos or not. Nearly all of those lost were entirely unprepared for survival outside civil order, outside of modernity and the built environment. Civility and modernity. For centuries on end, we dwelt there, safe and happy, and it certainly worked, but only until it didn't. Day 8. No food. Midday, I walked down to the supermarket to see what could be had. I'd heard some rumors about the shelves being empty and wanted to see for myself if that was the case. I also wanted to get a sense of the situation on the ground, and a short walk seemed like the best way to capture that. There was very little traffic on the streets. I passed a burned-out car halfway to the market. Maybe that was the source of the smoke I got a whiff of the day prior. For the first time ever, I noticed dogs running loose in the streets, mostly larger dogs. They were either escaping or were being let loose by their previous owners. The market was open, but they were only letting people in a few at a time. This reminded me of the COVID-19 restrictions. I waited in line and listened to the conversations being had around me. I sensed a lot of anxiety. In about a minute, I heard enough to construct the picture. The east side of town was cleaned out of food and supplies, and many of the smaller markets had been looted and set ablaze. People were driving 100 miles or more just on the rumor of stores still having food. As I waited in line to get in, I reminded myself how this had been anticipated. I had always said, once the fossil fuels stop, you'll have another week of food on the shelves and then nothing. It was beginning to look like we hadn't lasted even that long. I got into the store and found the employees rationing what little was left, some canned things, baked bread, and fruits and vegetables. The latter didn't look too good. I took what was offered and paid cash at the register. One shopping bag of goods, half full, and it cost a bit over $100. I didn't question it. On the way out, there were two men, one on either side of the automatic doors, both of them asking to buy my groceries for any amount I cared to name. They looked equal parts earnest and desperate. White men, well-dressed, probably not used to begging for food, and, like the rest of us, never could have imagined doing so. I hesitated, instinctively not wanting to part with anything, but then thought better. I gave each man a can of green beans from my bag and a can of diced tomatoes. That was all the canned foods I had. They both thanked me. One offered me a $20 bill, and the other a handful of smaller bills. I bid them keep their money and wished them good luck. It felt good, while it also made me a little sad. If this was their last stand, then their prospects were not good. On the way home, I stayed off the main road and instead walked the neighborhood back streets. This so as not to attract attention from anyone driving past and seeing an old guy with a bag of groceries. I gave the neighborhood a good inspection while I was about it. Some places were boarded up. Most others just looked empty. Were the people bugging out? Or were they just lying low? It was impossible to say. Either choice made as much sense. I got home and my wife and I sat down to a simple lunch of rice and beans with fresh sugar pod peas from the garden. She was pleased with the fruit and vegetables. I didn't mention the canned goods I'd given away. To be honest, I had already forgotten them and just now remembered as I write this. While we ate, the police scanner chattered away in the background. It didn't sound good at all. I mentioned the burned out car. Otherwise, we didn't talk much. Far away, in every direction, was the wail of sirens. After that day, I would never hear the like again. City services were already in terminal collapse. The neighborhood committee, as I came to think of it, called a meeting for that afternoon. I went mostly to listen, as I wasn't sure where everyone's head was at. The conversation was of no substance, mostly complaining about the difficulty finding gasoline and the price being over $10 per gallon when you did find it. Well, complaining is a luxury, isn't it? I didn't state the obvious, that fuel at any price would shortly vanish, likely forever. I doubt they would have understood. Footnote for Brigid. Crude oil hit $364 per barrel about now. Airlines were grounded, apparently globally, partly because of fuel shortages, but mostly because of violence at airports. Foreign deployed elements of the U.S. military were being recalled by order of the President. Day 9. Who hesitates is lost. My food shipment arrived from SoCal. The driver, looking harassed, came to the door and asked me where I wanted it, and I pointed to the driveway. Using an electric hand truck, he unloaded a plastic-wrapped 4x4-foot wood pallet piled high with sacks and boxes and dropped it on the bricks. He handed me some paperwork listing the inventory of my purchase, and I could see there was going to be 2 pallets. He then went back to his truck. I was expecting him to come back with the second pallet, but instead he jumped into the cab and drove off. So that's how it was going to be. Either he had helped himself to the other part of my shipment, or someone else had taken it. I was pissed at first, but then I realized I was lucky to have anything at all. That's when it came home to me, how everything that had seemed normal was being stretched out of shape, made unfamiliar. I also wondered if the driver had his home in Southern California, and if he was making plans to get out. On this day, I wrote on the inside wall of my garage in large spray-painted letters, "Who hesitates is lost." Hesitation is kin to fear, where fear makes us freeze up. If I hadn't placed the order, if the distributor hadn't gone the extra mile to find a hauler, if I hadn't greased the wheels with more cash, or if the driver had simply headed home with the entire lot, any of those wrong turns in the process, and I would have ended up with nothing whatsoever. I was indeed lucky. Amazingly so, it seemed to me. Without thinking too much about it, I broke open the shipment and carted everything behind the side gate. From there, I had time to haul everything into the basement. It took the rest of the day. I kept the pallet for the wood. Our committee met just after noon. There was more news about city services closing up shop and problems with cell phone services. Home internet access was becoming sketchy, and websites were going offline. This came as a surprise. Cell towers are heavy infrastructure. To see them faltering without there being a big event like an earthquake left me baffled. Same with the residential internet. It was an early sign of how vulnerable all this really was, as we would confirm later. Footnote to Brigid. Crude oil hit $482 per barrel today, and all trading was stopped indefinitely. None of us knew it at the time, but the global crude oil-based economy had been destroyed. Day 10. Shaping Strategies. Note to Brigid. From here, it becomes harder to recall everything as it happened. There are some significant events I can still narrow down to days or weeks. The timing doesn't much matter, but the order of operations maybe does. I'll attempt to maintain the order, at least. By day 15, I have regular journal updates in real time, but even those become sketchy during hardships. It was none too smooth going much of the time. I won't try to gloss that over. It is what it is. You know as well as I how this turned out. The neighborhood committee met again in our neighbor's garage. It was awkward. Everyone was nervous and suspicious. I had a lot on my mind and wasn't really paying that much attention. We went around sharing what we had heard of events in our immediate urban area, around the country, and out in the wider world. It didn't sound any too good to me. Locally, they were seeing consistent and violent looting of food supplies, and on a larger scale, a kind of constant stochastic mayhem. A woman in the group who lived alone, I didn't recognize her, said she was afraid. Someone had been moving around her house at night, trying doors and windows. Her calm account of it set my skin crawling. She had come to the meeting to ask for advice. Nobody was ready to doubt her, but they all got really vague about helping. There was general agreement that, in such case, she ought to call the police. I noticed right away how anxious she became on hearing that, meaning she had already tried 911 to no results. When she fell silent, seeming resigned to her fate, I came right out and asked if she needed another place to stay. The awkward meeting got even more awkward. They needed to hear that. I wanted them to think about it. We were meeting to build a strong neighborhood response to the changing times. What exactly did they think that meant? Nobody offered her nobody offered their spare space to her, nor did I. I really didn't have any, to be honest. We were way behind the curve still on day 10. That was about to change. Eviction day came, and the Costa Rican neighbors moved into the space I had loosely prepared on the patio. They were equal parts grateful, humiliated, and terrified. The young mother cried a lot. I kept telling the father, his name is Jose, his wife Lupe, to not worry about anything and that we'd figure it out as we go. He kept saying thank you so that I could have cried. Damn, that was hard for them. In an attempt to change the subject, I asked if they had heard from their daughter's husband. They had not. They spent the afternoon dragging over their clothes and food, leaving most of their other personal belongings in the rental. The late summer weather was cooperating, but I started to think about the coming winter. That meant just one thing: shelter. Footnote for Brigid. Crude oil trades were halted within the first 10 minutes of the session open and then postponed for 24 hours. In those few minutes, the price had swung between $400 and $900 per barrel before the halt. Day 11. Seeds of an idea. That woman living alone, she moved out. She told one of her neighbors how she was going to spend some time with her parents in Palm Springs until things sorted themselves out. I would have advised against that. Better to bring them here to live with her instead, but I wasn't being consulted. She was worried about her home being broken into, so one of the older neighbor boys moved into her place to keep an eye on it. It was the right thing to do, even if slightly dangerous. The neighborhood committee decided to begin meeting every day. All around us, things were coming unglued. Several nearby homes had been invaded, their owners and occupants assaulted, and the houses ransacked for anything not nailed down. Mostly food and fuel. It was senseless and terrifying, and the people on my block were in a fit state as a result. We had to do something, but we didn't know what. We conducted an inventory of who had weapons and found that few did. Some handguns. Someone had a shotgun. I had a .270 hunting rifle with a scope that I had inherited from my father, with 2 boxes of ammo. It was a hard moment for everyone there. Self-defense-wise, it was not nearly enough. If the police were being systematically overwhelmed, then we were likewise unprepared. This was when I sprung my idea on them. I had been thinking about it for a long time. It went like this. It was time to combine our resources, act in unity, and become optimally self-sufficient as a community. That meant creating a defensible, shared space as a start. This was broadly, if cautiously, accepted. My first suggestion was we go to our backyards and tear down the fences between our lots. All our backyards would then be connected. We could use the fence boards to erect hard defenses between houses and to board over doors and windows facing the street. Anything left of the fence boards, use those to create walkways between yards so people could get around easily if it rained. Anyone having trouble at home would then need only escape to any nearby home, and we would leave our back doors unlocked against that possibility. Don't knock, just go straight in and raise the alarm. I was fishing this idea and expected outright refusal. To my mild surprise, they thought it was a brilliant idea. The talk turned away from weapons and hopelessness and toward strategic planning instead. I knew it would take a few days to get the others on board with the idea and a few days more to perfect our preparations, but ultimately it was the right move for the greatest effect. More important, we were acting in concert for our mutual benefit. In the end, we were focusing a lot less on weapons and defending ourselves as individuals, and more on tools and materials, team building, and coordinated responses. Looking back, I think that was the pivotal moment in our attitude about the future. We all agreed to go door to door to recruit others into the hardening effort and to figure out escape routes should anyone come under attack. Not everyone in the neighborhood is a homeowner. Renters can't really make decisions about property they don't own. There was a lot of unhelpful discussion about property rights, and I was thinking to myself how that approach was already antiquated. Nor would property rights stop the invaders when they came for us. Sharing my thoughts aloud, I pointed out that the city was turning into a slow-burning dumpster fire, and that if we didn't move our libertarian asses fast, some of us would be living under tarps down by the river, or pushing up daisies. It might not have been the most polite way to put it, but I certainly made my point. They got it. They didn't like it, but they didn't disagree either. None of this resolved the matter of what to do with renters, but I was already of an opinion that most of these details would resolve themselves one way or another, and shortly. Our neighborhood is cut up with single-lane cross streets. It's an old neighborhood, and the streets, while good, are narrow. It makes it cozy in a way and has the effect of keeping neighbors in close contact. Almost nobody here moves away. Many have lived in family homes for decades, including my wife and me. As such, plenty of people and families know each other, even from childhood. Some of the people in our neighborhood discussions were not nearby neighbors, but a street or two away. That could complicate mutual aid and the challenge of creating safe corridors. The neighborhood project was probably bigger than most of us cared to consider. I overheard some neighbors offering others to come if called. That is a good enough solution for now, but it won't work at scale. Not after all this falls apart in a big way. I went home and stood in the garage, cataloging my remaining building materials and looking at the wall and reading, "Who hesitates is lost." On day 11, we are all in. Toward evening, I made another trip to the hardware outlet for construction materials. Lumber, plywood, the last 5 pieces of drywall, and some R15 roll insulation. I already had everything else needed to build with, including electrical and plumbing and a spare utility sink. Given a few days, the Mora family will have a nice little space under my back patio. Tomorrow, we can get to work. Day 12. The Fire Within. Our commitment to harden the perimeter came too late. 2 of our neighbors down the block, who, as it happened, hadn't been at the meeting, were attacked during the night. A group of men seems to have rolled up in trucks and just battered the doors in. The occupants hadn't put up a fight, so nobody was seriously injured. But the home was completely lost. After the raiders took everything they wanted, meaning everything not bolted down, they set fire to the place. The fire could have been set deliberately to cause a distraction, or due to a loose gas line or something. Same result either way. The fire department never showed. We had some trouble fighting the fire ourselves, not the least because the effort had to wait until the raiders had left the area. But thereafter, with some effort, the fire did not spread. In the end, everyone was okay. We distributed our suddenly homeless neighbors to suitable retreats and saw to their emotional support. This morning, with a quick meeting in the street across from the burned-out shell, we set about salvaging anything we could from the rubble and boarding up the front. At the same time, we decided the common perimeter needed more hardening, and quickly, even after the fire. Only about half the neighborhood understood and accepted the urgency to make serious changes. The community spent the day working their butts off, tearing down back fences, pulling up posts, and using the liberated materials to fully cover windows and doors that faced the street. I've never seen so many people working hard all at the same time on a single project. It was brutal, but by the end of the day, well after dark, they had done the best they could for nearly all the 45 single-family homes on our block. As for the holdouts, I had little hope. While others worked on the perimeter, Jose and I started working on a small one-room shell inside the perimeter of the patio. To my thinking, the patio roof would keep out the rain, and the insulated shell will provide an enclosed shelter. It was good work, and I think it improved everyone's spirits. I know it did mine. When things get bad, I like to stay busy. On that last trip to Home Depot, I may have got the last building materials to be had in the county. Note to Brigid. Crude oil trades remain halted. It no longer matters. Service stations are gutted ruins. Tanker drivers have fled with their families. The crude oil economy is ended in all but name. And I will stop there. That was the first 12 chapters of It Was 100 Days. Each chapter is a day, and some of them are longer than others. I won't always be able to get 12 chapters in a reading, but we'll keep at it and we'll get through it. Like I said, this is really like a second or third draft. It's not really the final form. If you ever pick this up on Amazon direct publishing as an ebook or a hard copy, it might be different. It's 250 pages, and it's going to take a couple of sittings to get through this thing. But I'm enjoying reading it, and so far it looks pretty sane to me. And this is probably the final draft for some of this stuff. I will stop here. I have a dinner to make. I have some food to eat, and we will do this again probably tomorrow. Thanks for listening, and do come back.